So colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this quite wonderful occasion for King's, the second round of our King's Lectures. It's happening on a very exciting day for King's because I think some of you in the audience attended earlier when Her Majesty the Queen and the Duchess of Cambridge opened the Bush House complex, which was all over the news and went very well. So if I look exhausted, it's not the emotional strain of Alison's lecture, it's having Her Majesty and the Duchess visit, but that was quite a wonderful occasion. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ed Byrne, the principal here, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all for this, the second lecture in the second series of King's Lectures, with the incredibly topical theme, universities, the economy and the state. One advantage of a series which develops its theme over 3 lectures, hence our subtitle, a theme in 3 acts, is that we can hold at least one of the lectures at a different campus. We're therefore delighted to be at the Guy's campus this evening, and my notes say to see a full house. I think we're getting closer to the full house with each moment that goes by. Welcome to you all. Our distinguished speaker for this second series is, of course, Alison Wolf, Baroness Wolf of Dulwich, CBE, the Sir Roy Griffith Professor of Public Sector Management in our King's Business School, Director of the International Centre for University Policy Research within the King's Policy Institute, a member of our council, and a hugely positive contributor in so many areas to our university. Those of you who attended Alison's absolutely wonderful first lecture at the Strand, Blue Chips and Bubbles, Why Were Universities the 20th Century's Most Successful Institutions, will, like me, be anticipating another very special occasion. Our concept in the King's Lectures is one of allowing time in which to develop arguments with a unifying theme. So, once again, Alison will use history and what it teaches us, this time about how to make policy. Alison specialises in the relationship between education and the labour market, with a particular interest in training and skills policy, an interest in universities and in the medical workforce, and she is highly involved in policy debate. In February of last year, she was appointed as a member of the independent expert panel member for the English government's review of post-18 education and finance, which is about to report. So tonight's intriguing title, dare I say it, those interesting in these very interesting political times, is Making Higher Education Policy a Case Study in Governments at their Best and Worst. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for the second in the 2019 series of King's Lectures, our own Professor Alison Wolf.
Thank you very much, Ed. Well, good evening, everybody. And as Ed has said, the theme of this series of lectures is universities, the economy and the state. I'm actually going to say very little about the economy in this particular lecture, a great deal about universities and probably even more about the state. As I, not particularly originally, emphasised in my first lecture, universities are creatures of the state. They have been creatures of the state for all of their history. For much of it, they were creatures of the church as well. And sometimes states created them, mostly states created them. Sometimes they revitalised them. At other times, they have neglected and destroyed them. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is, in large part, one of the great triumphs of state policy, which was the creation of the Modern Research University. And it's actually a particularly good lecture for me to be giving on this campus because, of course, here we're in the heart of the health schools and the heart of the science part of King's, which epitomises the Modern Research University. I'm then going to turn to more modern policy making, much more recent policy making, and explain a little bit about why it's so hard and why, on the whole, states are making something of a mess of it. So just to skim the sort of the very long history of universities, the university, as I think everybody knows, is a creation in its present form of medieval Europe and indeed early modern Europe. It spread across the university spread across the continent. And because for the first part of their history, there was a divided authority, they reaped the benefits of divided authority. The combination and the often fractious relationship of the church and the state at this point allowed them to secure corporate privileges and often autonomy and often endowments. But I think it's important to remember that during this period, although they housed some very heterodox and original thinkers, these were essentially vocational institutions. They were vocational institutions training, above all at this point, the clergy and also other professions, especially law and medicine. They were highly committed to learning, and whenever I give lectures, I try to include this because it's one of my favorite passages ever. It's from the papal bull from Pope Alexander VI, giving permission for the establishment of a university in Aberdeen in response to a petition from Bishop Elphiston, and it opines that, considering in this part of the kingdom of the Scots there are men who are rude, ignorant of letters, and almost barbarous, it would be highly appropriate to set up a university in the actually not very famous city of Old Aberdeen, where there should flourish a university where such men could apply themselves to the study of letters and acquire that most precious pearl of knowledge. And I actually think that's a wonderful, wonderful passage, but it doesn't say anything about research. So fast forwarding, you then get to the 18th century, about which I also talked quite a bit in my first lecture, because after a period in which the universities boomed and a period in which the world was also riven by theological dispute, the 18th century was a period of decline for the universities. And I have argued that it was, in fact, entirely conceivable that they would have continued to decline and become essentially rather irrelevant relic institutions, while all sorts of other things that were important went on around them. And because that didn't happen, we think it was inevitable that it didn't happen, but very little in history is actually inevitable. And what was happening during the 18th century is, I think, very interesting, because science was developing, but it was developing outside the universities. It was largely self-funded by affluent scientists who carried it on in their own homes, or increasingly in institutes and clubs and societies, which brought together people who were interested, many of them from, particularly in 18th century England, but then later on in the provincial towns of France and Germany and Italy, people who were involved in business, people who were involved in the modern economy, and who also had a strong interest as amateurs in science. And the Royal Society paved the way under Royal Charter in 1660, but institutes and societies followed it all around the developed countries of Europe. Now, universities did not vanish. They were still training the clergy, of whom there were very many, and in most of the rest of Europe, they continued to train the professions, the doctors and lawyers. But interestingly, much less so in England. The Inns of Court became the main training ground for lawyers, and of course, here we are standing down at Guy's. The hospitals in England, not the universities, paved the way for medical training. So formal anatomy lectures started at Thomas in 1649. There was joint teaching at Guy's and St Thomas's from 1750, and the independent medical school here at Guy's started in 1825. Before that, it was joint. And this was where mostly quite affluent young men, at that point obviously young men, trained to become doctors, not in the ancient universities. Now, at the same time, it's very interesting to note, rather comparable things were happening in Germany. Now, anybody who knows about the modern research university at any level can tell you, well, it all started in Germany, and indeed, so it did. But when you start digging into the history, you discover, as so often, that it's all a bit more complicated than this sort of simple pathway which starts with Humboldt saying research should be part of teaching, and then somehow light and funding follow and flow forth. It's never quite that simple. And in fact, in the 18th century, scientific research was focused very much around academies and institutes. These were set up by the states, and I mean the states because, again, at this point there was no united Germany, but the individual states were setting up institutes and funding them, and academies, and these were supported by the local aristocracy and the local worthies. And in fact, what became the most famous institute of all was set up before Prussia was Prussia by Frederick III of Brandenburg, who founded the Berlin Academy in 1700, and it later became known as the Royal Prussian Academy of Sciences, and the most famous in Central Europe. But this was not at this point, as I said, in the universities. And the other thing, which is actually quite extraordinary, and I only found this graph, which comes from a book by DeSolla Price when I was preparing this lecture, is the speed with which scientific journals emerged. Now, they didn't all survive, so this is a cumulative number of creations, and some of them would have fallen by the wayside by 1830. But what is interesting is how many journals were being founded in a period when science was not really a university pursuit. So at that point, it seemed quite possible that universities would become less central to secular life. They would essentially become professional training grounds. They would not be the center of academic or intellectual endeavor. And in fact, the French Revolution, as I described in my first lecture, abolished universities, and individual universities didn't come back to France until the very end of the 19th century. And again, what is interesting is that German intellectuals of the 18th century also called for their abolition. They saw them as reactionary, they were intellectually sterile, they were sources of local patronage. Most of the people who taught in them had no particular interest in scholarship. They were essentially the top local lawyers, the top local doctors, the top local clergy. And yet, it was in this Germany of the 18th century, before Napoleon came down and sort of cast local privilege to the winds temporarily, that the research university was in fact emerging. It was emerging as central to intellectual and economic progress, and it was emerging because of the state, or rather the states. So what I've put up here is an extremely simplified version of the road to the modern research university. And it starts in Germany, but it completes its journey in the United States, which looked to Germany for inspiration, but as so often with policy borrowing, what it thought it was borrowing was a bit different from the original, and is in a way far more directly like the institution that we're standing in today. So let me start with the German universities. German universities of the 18th and 19th century, which again, as we know, created, well, many of us know, created the whole idea of the scientific apprenticeship, the professor in their laboratory. All of this can be traced right back. But in order to understand how it happened, you need a map of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as many people have mentioned, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But that was the Germany of its day. And as you can see, it was a bit of a mess. We have somewhere hiding in our bookcases at home a sort of a book that I found on a stall in Italy once, which was about the customs duties that had to be levied as you moved stuff back and forth across the German-speaking world of that time. And, well, I'm not surprised there was a lot of smuggling. So this was the Holy Roman Empire. This was the German-speaking world as late as the eve of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, from which indirectly Prussia and modern Germany arrived. And I do apologize to historians in the audience for the fact that I am rampaging through exceptions, issues. This is a wildly simplified gallop, but it does lead to the research university. And interestingly enough, the most important place for this story was actually ruled by the Hanoverians. Now, if you grow up in England and you do English history, the last thing you think of is the Hanoverian kings as enlightened intellectuals riding forth into the bright scientific future. And if those of you who didn't grow up in England and haven't done Hanoverian history, just go and look up George I, George II, and indeed George III, and you will see that this is really an enormous irony. So basically, back in their home country state of Hanover, or rather actually their first minister, Munchausen, founded a new university. Founded it in 1734 at Göttingen, and that's what it looked like at the time. I mean, it had quite a grand building, but actually not a very grand building compared to what we're used to today. And the point is that these small states had ambitions, and some of them had very interesting and enlightened ambitions. And the two universities that were most important were the universities of Halle, which was founded in 1694, and especially Göttingen. And those two universities basically revolutionized the way that university teaching was carried on. They reformed the curriculum, they developed scholarship, they developed pedagogy. That was where the seminar, which we have all hopefully enjoyed in its moderately pure form. Today, many seminars in Germany have about 90 or 100 attendees, but that was not the case in Göttingen in 1750s. So they were doing these things. Now, the thing that was also happening right across Germany, and this is what I mean about the importance of the state, was that the old corporate privileges of the universities were being taken away. So the universities were actually, and this is what's so interesting, they were becoming less and less independent and autonomous in many ways. The rulers of these small, conservative or autocratic states actually had tremendous power over these universities, and for the most part they just left them to trundle on training people and giving professorships to the local worthies. But if you had an enlightened ruler, and particularly an enlightened ruler who wanted to compete with other enlightened rulers and show that he could do better than the other person, you actually got something happening which was quite new. So the corporate privileges were gone. The power of the church in this area had also gone. And the combination of this decentralization and, in some cases, very active support meant that it created a market in scholarship. These places were recruiting leading scholars from across Germany. Now, at this point, there was still not the idea that discovery and research was at the heart of it. This is a reformation in terms of scholarship, learning, and teaching. It's more like the vision of that bull setting up the University of Aberdeen. And the students were either wealthy or destined for public sector, including church careers. But it was out of this 18th century small-scale reform movement and competition that you get the development of research careers and the research university. And what you get is you get the research laboratories emerging in 19th century Germany within the context of autocratic states and very strong controls over the labor market. So post-Napoleon, you start the rise of Prussia. As I said, my apologies to 19th century historians and German historians, but basically Prussia's on and up. And this is not a country that practices freedom of speech. These are state-controlled universities, but they are committed to high-quality scholarship and to disciplinary autonomy. So you can't start going off message and arguing with the ruler. And in fact, if you go back to Göttingen, one of the reasons it's famous is that when Queen Victoria became queen here, Hanover reverted to the male line because she couldn't rule Hanover. And at that point, I guess he must have been her third cousin or something, revoked the constitution. And there was a huge row, and some of the professors, including the Grimm brothers, protested, and they were thrown out of their jobs, and they had to leave the state, and they were jobless for some time. So these are not democratic, liberal countries in the sense that we would expect. But they are states which value scholarship and increasingly disciplinary research. And they also are states, particularly again in Prussia in this case, which created a structure for the scientific career. And first of all, you had to have the right qualification. You had to have the habilitation, which is, as you can probably guess, originally a French word, because at this point the German upper classes mostly spoke French to each other. So without that, you couldn't hold a professorship. And for that, you actually had to do a piece of proper research and new scholarship. And at the same time, the people, the younger academics, were able to work as, well, you can see that this word, you can probably work out what this word means. It's privat, private, and docent, which means teacher. So you worked as a private teacher for fees. So you were not salaried by the state, but you could work, there was a structure, you had fees paid to you by the students, and this became institutionalized gradually all over Germany, and that was the rate where you came through to becoming a professor in a discipline, which again is quite different. These are academic disciplines, these are not the training of professors, of professions. In fact, interestingly, the German universities of this time were pretty snooty about professional training. I'll come back to that in a moment. This was about pure knowledge and pure disciplines. And once again, what you were getting was you were getting the state coffers funding new chairs, laboratories, and you get professors concentrating their teaching on a few favored students who are aiming at academic careers and developing them as excellent scholars and increasingly as excellent research scientists. So there you have the University of Berlin in 1810 in its early glory. And the point is that although it was the biggest, the best, the most famous in the 19th century, it was not the only one. There was genuine competition from other parts of Germany for excellent science professors, just as Prussia was trying to hire people in. The other thing that was happening, and again, this is a little bit like what happened later with our own civic universities, but it was much more clearly the industrialists. Local industries and businesses directed funds to their own local universities. So actually, chemistry laboratories were not pioneered in Berlin. They were pioneered in Gießen. The University of Jena was transformed by industrial money. And in Prussia, you have organized industrial lobbies lobbying the state to fund chairs in industrial chemistry. But the interesting thing is that actually technology and engineering were not taught in the universities. They were taught in separate institutions. And I wouldn't want to go on record for this because I didn't have time to check, but I have a feeling there was probably an engineering professor in Cambridge before there was an engineering professor in a full-blown German university as opposed to a technical university. So these are sort of pure knowledge places. Now, by this point, they were becoming very famous. But again, these are not huge numbers. What was interesting is that if you look at this, which is the student numbers by faculty in Prussia at the beginning of the 20th century, it's not that everybody was doing science. 14% of people were doing science. There's still people doing the traditional professional careers, and also a large number studying humanities. So it's 14% doing natural sciences in Prussia, and it's 12% doing natural sciences in Oxford. So it's not that this was the only place doing science. It's not that it was the only place that science mattered, but it was the place that had created incredibly effective scientific laboratories and scientific careers. And at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, the reputation of German science was at its zenith. Universities were organized to develop science careers, there were high prestige professors, and as we again probably know, before the catastrophe of fascism, Nazism, Germany dominated Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry. Many of those people then fled, emigrated. But I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Thomas Edison's workshops in West Orange in New Jersey, but there is his study is there. And the striking thing is that the journals which are lined up in the bookcases, and which you can see there, are German language. If you wanted to study science seriously at that point, if you wanted to keep up with science seriously at that point, you had to read German. So that was Germany, and as I said, it was a function of the state. It was not a function of throwing things open in a liberal environment, and there was certainly no general commitment to freedom of speech, quite the opposite. But there was a commitment to disciplinary autonomy, disciplinary equality, and there was competition to do this from states that believed in it. Now, the Americans very quickly decided that Germany was the place which knew about science, and if their universities were going to develop expertise in science, they would have to go to Germany to learn how to do it. And in fact, as early as 1802, Yale sent one of its professors to Germany to, quote, learn some science. Yale began a PhD program, which was modeled on the German approach in 1860, and then in 1876 Johns Hopkins established a research university which was inspired by Germany, although it was actually not quite the same. And then later on we get the big increase in public funding for science, and PhD training starts to take on the role that it has everywhere today. But Johns Hopkins, which was, as I said, founded in principle on the German model, was actually not really very German at all in key respects. This, I have to say, was not the state. This was actually Johns Hopkins. This is, if you like, semi-private enterprise. Basically, that's where the departmental structure, the graduate schools started. That's where there were first jobs for young scientists, which were actually paid as opposed to having to scrape a living getting fees from students. And it was also the American universities that were most open to new subjects and to professionally related studies. So clinical medicine was important at Johns Hopkins from very early on. It is not something that the German universities would have allowed into their portals at that point. And what you can see at this point is you can see the rise of the scientific profession, and you can see how many scientists there already were. So already, by the 1930s, you've got tens of thousands of scientists, and the number has gone up, and so has the number per million population. So was that just industry? Was that just private universities like Johns Hopkins living off charity? No, that was also the state. You cannot separate the rise of the research university in America any more than you can separate the rise of the research university in Germany from the active funding of government after government. Now, American innovation, their willingness to create new structures, their willingness to let new subjects in above all, is, I think, very related to the fact that they were also very decentralized, as had been 18th and early 19th century Germany. And it's also, I think, related to the fact that at this point, again, there were many private universities for whom innovative ways of bringing people who would pay fees were important. But basic research funding has always been overwhelmingly from the state. The National Institutes of Health were founded as long ago as the 1870s, and although they've had large institutes, they have always given a large part of their funding to the universities. The National Science Foundation is actually a particularly interesting body. It was first conceived under the New Deal as something that would be very tightly state-controlled. And there was big arguments after the Second World War about how it would be done, and the first bill was vetoed by Truman, and in the end the second bill went through in the way that we know it today, effectively controlled by scientists, and it was established in 1950. And one of the interesting things about the National Science Foundation is that it's probably the last thing practically in Washington that enjoys bipartisan support. It really does. And Again, although the key point that I want to emphasize is that it has always gone in for competitive funding of limited term grants using merit or peer review, it's also a system which has always tied the training of young scientists through PhDs to large parts of its grant program. And that's a basic model that's been used in many other countries, although not many people can begin to think of the sort of levels of funding that the United States goes in for. So National Institutes of Health, again, a lot of that funding goes out to universities, $37 billion, National Science Foundation, $8 billion. So America was the first to produce this level of active professional scientists based in universities, funded in large part from central government grants on this scale. Other countries also had this kind of funding, we've seen that, but you compare the sort of the number of jobs that would have been around in Prussian universities in 1920 or 1930 with the scale of science in the United States already then, never mind since. And as you can see, if you look at this one way, you say, oh, America has far more science than Europe does. If you look at it another way, you say, the number of researchers, the number of science researchers per million inhabitants in Europe as well is now enormous and continuing to rise. And just to sort of quickly come back to the UK, since that's where we are, the UK was very slow to develop a PhD career path, but it now has almost 300,000 scientists, which is quite a lot of people. A high proportion of them are academics, over 60%. And I think the other thing which it's important to remember is that it's university-based science which underpins UK universities' high rankings in international tables. And since 1965, we've had the research councils at the core of funding alongside, as part of dual state support alongside quality-related funding. And we've also had the Haldane principle, which is about ensuring that state research funding is allocated on the basis of quality as judged by your peers. And that principle was actually enshrined in legislation in the Higher Education Research Act in 2017. So here we have the modern research university, which I think most people would consider, I would consider, one of the great glories of the modern world. It enshrines a commitment to research based on evidence, based on the freedom of scientists to develop and test hypotheses, and which is nonetheless supported and was created by the state. And I think there are a number of things which are worth underlining about it. First of all, it happened because the state created institutions. It wasn't just about giving money out to people. At every point, there was also a commitment to creating an institution with life, an institution with stability. That was part of the deal. That's actually particularly obvious, in fact, in the German case, slightly less so in the American case, where a lot of this goes out through grants. But it is also, I think, at the core of the dual support approach which has been taken by this country, which is that a lot of our research funding, which comes to us through the REF, is about creating institutional support. And I think you cannot understand the development of the research university, its scale, its reach, and the volume of research that it produces without understanding that it comes out of a commitment by governments to creating institutions. It also comes clearly, as part of this, out of the fact that the state spent a lot of money. None of this would have happened, none of this could have happened if governments had not been directly involved. The third thing, which is slightly less of an unmitigated good, if you like, is that the state provides the licensing. It gives you an incentive to get the letters after your name, the requirements. In England, this is not actually in law. In theory, you can still be a lifelong professor without, as far as I know, even having a bachelor's degree, never mind a PhD. But all I can say is these days you try. In most countries, this is effectively a licensed profession, and the state power to give licenses underpins it. The fourth thing, where again I would actually just like to say in passing that this has had rather little to do with society-wide free speech, is that this has been possible because governments signed up to internal disciplinary autonomy. Now, that has not been true of governments all the time. The sad history of some parts of Soviet science are monuments to cases where the government actually got involved. The very vicious battles in Washington immediately after the Second World War over the National Science Foundation and how it should be run relate to this and to the absolute determination of some key players that decisions would be made by scientists. The fifth thing, and I'm going to come back to this, is that, in my opinion, and it's not just my opinion, none of this would have happened either if there hadn't been competition. Because competition basically meant that, given these other things, people fought for the good people. There was an incentive to be good and not merely friendly, and that this has been absolutely central to the way in which science has developed. But I think the other thing one has to realize is that in terms of deliberate policy, nobody in Göttingen in 1750 envisaged King's today, MIT, Harvard, or indeed the modern Humboldt University and network of institutes across Germany. This was not a huge visionary move. A lot of it was luck, it was small scale, and quite a lot of it was to do with states that wanted to brag and not just about states that wanted to advance knowledge. So, as so often, there was a lot of serendipity here, there was a lot of luck, as well as a genuine commitment, and I think it is important to understand this, a genuine commitment by governments to funding science, knowledge, and inquiry. Now, all of those factors remain central to creating and maintaining top quality research institutions today. But they do so within a profoundly changed environment, which governments are finding it quite difficult to deal with. And without being able to foresee the future, I think it's important to understand that this model has gone on, and it's one to which the world has signed up, including signing up to the ideas of funding by competition on peer review, commitment, genuine commitment to the idea that disciplinary autonomy is the way to quality. So I think those ideas have not been seriously challenged by anybody and are in fact ones which genuinely most governments sign up to. But the environment in which they take place is very different. German science was always very small. The professors across Germany who were appointed individually as individuals by the state, the total number of state-funded positions for professors, not just in the sciences generally, in 1909 was just a bit over 3,000. You compare that with the number of scientists today. Laboratories were small, they were personal. There were problems with the German approach, by the way. I mean, as I said, I think the move to disciplinary to departments and graduate schools in the US was a precondition for becoming large scale. But the point is, it was small. So from the point of view of the state, you actually had it in your hand. You knew what you were funding, you knew what you were getting. And of course, higher education at that point, as I said in my first lecture, was generally very small. It involved a tiny proportion of the population. And this is no longer true. That was the whole of Somerville College, Oxford, in 1885, when it was the beginning of female higher education. And I haven't been able to find a comparable photo of the whole of a small liberal arts college, so I'm putting that one up. But as you know, by now, more than half the students in higher education are women. But the point is that these were tiny institutions. And today, we have mass delivery, and we have mass accreditation. We are also spending an enormous amount of money. This is just the government R&D budget in the UK. So again, we're going up into many billions of pounds, more or less a quarter of the total R&D expenditure, not just the government spending, but the total R&D expenditure spent by universities. And this is a substantial part of what the government is spending for a large number of objectives. Now, what I've put up there is the proportion of GDP spent by governments on R&D and tertiary education taken together. So the R&D is the blue bit, and the tertiary education is the sort of the golden bit, and the purple bit is the bit altogether. And when you show this to politicians, they immediately go, oh, X is spending more than us, and Y is spending less than us. But I just want to draw to your attention that this is actually, for governments that have to spend on pensions, on welfare, on health, on infrastructure, on defense, this is a large part of the money which is, in a sense, money they can make decisions about. It's a very, very large part of the kind of non-compulsory spending that governments engage in. And I'm going to come back to this in the third lecture, because basically we are as societies making big bets on science, R&D, and tertiary education. And although there are indeed differences, and the United States is higher, and the UK is not particularly high, which is why we currently have a target to raise it, and Japan seems to be doing quite nicely on rather a lower level, the reality is that these are huge sums of money, absolutely huge. The other thing which is different is that we also have created university systems in which we depend increasingly on international reputation and international fees. And those of us that have a high research reputation attract overseas students, we attract high fee income, we create a virtuous circle. The reputation is overwhelmingly research reputation. What puts you at the top of an international league table? Research. So our research universities actually have a double incentive now, and they therefore are both major winners and have a huge and slightly frightening stake in a system which, first of all, offers huge sums of money, and secondly says, and if you do well on that, you will also attract large numbers of students to come to you who will pay you large sums of money to do so. And just to again illustrate this, this is something that I used in the first lecture, the tiny little blue columns, which you can hardly see, are the number of students in France, Germany, and the UK in 1900. The orange ones are the number today. The grey ones are the numbers when you take out the international component. So what we have is we have universities that are bigger than ever, more important than ever, in which we are spending an enormous part of the bits of national income which we can actually make decisions about. Huge numbers, huge budgets, and the old style sort of steering where you kind of appointed professors and you sort of knew the heads of Oxford colleges, or you basically, if it was a state legislature in the United States, the same thing, everybody knew everybody in that state. That has gone. The demand for higher education is currently rising everywhere. And in this situation, governments feel, consciously or not, a need to have some sort of control of what is going on. Now, the simplest way that governments can cope with the rising demand for higher education is simply to spend less per student and open the doors. And this happens in a large number of countries, and it produces overcrowding, high dropout rates, and declining quality. It's very difficult to combine with high quality research in an institution that is undergoing that sort of strain. So one of the stresses and strains is related to how do you fund universities. So one thing you can do is you can try and step up detailed regulation. Another thing you can do is try and look for some other tools. And in the search for policy tools to try and gain some control over these institutions which the state is paying so much money and which it feels are increasingly, if you like, out of control. There are basically two things that they've thought of, and if anybody can think of a third. The third one is just to leave us to spend the money however we like, and I don't think that's on offer. So essentially there have just been two forms of doing this. One of them is direct control and command, and the other goes with quasi-markets. And both have their problems. So the first one is direct control, direct command, by regulation, by audit, or by central planning of numbers and both staff and student numbers, not on the sort of one-to-one basis that you had in the past, where you decided, oh, all right, I will fund a couple of chairs in industrial chemistry, but in terms of setting far larger targets. Regulation and audit. Detailed rules about how money can be spent, or about internal governance, or about quality assurance have multiplied. And this, again, is not just an English thing. We last year acquired the Office for Students, which is a far more hands-on regulatory agency than there's ever been before. But this is not a particularly unusual experience. If you talk to American colleagues, they will say of the public sector that in just about any state of the union, except maybe Texas, the funding has gone down. And in every state of the union, including, I suspect, Texas, the amount of regulation from the state legislature has gone up. So this is not an unusual thing. It's universal. But effective regulation is very difficult with a huge sector. You could kind of run a university when you were sort of the tiny state of Hanover and you knew all the professors. You could even run it a bit when you got to be the size of Prussia under in 1900, because there were very few students going. Today, this is very, very difficult. And also, governments have accepted that the arguments linking autonomy with quality, especially in scientific research, hold up. That in fact, the best research universities and the best research systems are those which allow some autonomy to their institutions. So this one goes on and off and on. The other way you can try and control things tightly is by some form of central planning based on manpower forecasts and labour market data. And governments really hanker after this. Even though intellectually they know that manpower planning hasn't worked too well in the past, they can't somehow leave this alone. They keep hoping that they'll get a clockwork system in which there'll be increased demand from the labour market here, which will feed seamlessly into producing students there, which will feed equally seamlessly into creating productive industry over there. And they keep worrying away at it. They would like it to roll really nicely. Now, the heyday of manpower planning was after the Second World War, and this one I thought, this was actually from Swaziland, but it's sort of a classic of the incredibly detailed planning that was still going on in the early 1980s, in which large numbers of people would labour to work out how many architects they had in the country in 1 year, how many they could expect in 1986, how many they could expect in 1993, and then give funding to the university faculties to produce that number of architects. Or indeed mechanics, or indeed plumbers and sheet metal workers. Sheet metal workers, by the way, no longer exist. They didn't exist even in Swaziland in 1993. But anyway, so you would think that this was impossible, but I promise you it is something which people keep doing. There is this perennial yearning for order, a seductive promise of modern technology. And in case you don't believe me, I am going to show you that the English are just as bad as everybody else. Who here remembers modernizing medical careers? Well, I promise you there will be a lot of people in Guy's Hospital who remember modernizing medical careers. This was the upshot of it. This was, I couldn't find a Guy's, but Guy's and Thomas, St. Thomas's Hospital, this was the upshot. And the idea was, and this, okay, this was technically junior doctors are not students, but actually in most of Europe they are, so I feel justified in bringing them into a lecture on universities. And they were all in university hospitals. So the idea was that you were going to match junior doctors to training opportunities, you were going to do it completely objectively, you were going to eliminate unfairness, there were going to be algorithms, everybody was going to start on a level playing field, there was going to be formalized, standardized scoring of applications, and it was all going to be done online simultaneously. Well, it didn't work. There was a complete mismatch between the number of places they thought they were offering and the number of people who applied. The IT system was overwhelmed, the algorithms failed, applications went missing, and in the end, the senior doctors basically said, we're just not going to do this anymore. But the important thing about this was that the people in central government believed they could do it partly because they believed they were doing it already. They thought they'd got training places and people were in them. But actually, they hadn't and they weren't. What there was a pot of money that came down to pay for training, and then there were the actual number of doctors and junior doctors and medical students that you had, and you spread the money across them. And that's kind of, this dual system is characteristic of all centrally planned economies. Which brings me, finally, to the market. And the market is basically the current big idea of higher education policy, because nobody can think of anything else. Because when you try to regulate from the center, you get chaos, and again, people may not remember modernizing medical careers here, but I bet there are quite a number of people like me who are old enough to remember the early days of the Quality Assurance Agency, and roomfuls of paper, boxes to be ticked, and in the end, it capsized under its own filing cabinet weight. So, and actually it collapsed because a certain number of people in LSE, one of whom was actually sitting here, went on strike, at which point the House of Cards collapsed. So direct regulation as a form of control doesn't work very well. Manpower planning, in spite of the hankering of many governments, doesn't work very well. And so what are you left with? Well, one of the things you're left with is competition in the market. And one of the reasons it seems so attractive is that, after all, as we've seen, competition is important. Our modern system of effective research grant funding is competitive. I've argued that Germany produced the modern research university because the small states competed with each other. And also, in terms of decentralization and competition, Johns Hopkins, I guess, was also particularly keen to develop something new because it wanted to be right up there with Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. So competition has a certain seduction. So if central planning doesn't work, why not leave it all to the markets with a bit of legislation? So as I said, competition has always been associated with quality and innovation, but trying to use it to manage mass systems is quite new. And interestingly, it's still less common in higher education than it is in school education, where what's known as choice policies have become very popular in large parts of the globe. And I have to say they work rather better in schools. And of course, it's not pure competition because we do live in democratic welfare states, and we basically therefore feel that a large part of education should be either directly funded by the state or funded through government-backed loans and grants. So it's what we call a quasi-market. The state provides most of the funding, it controls which institutions can participate, but you basically then leave it to the students to decide where to go, and you encourage new entrants. And that's what we have at the moment in England. And I should say at the moment, for those of you who hope that I'm going to say what's in the Alga review, as opposed to what's been leaked and which kites have been flown, I'm sorry, I'm not. But everything I'm going to say now, I've said on many occasions before. So higher education market is proclaimed loudly in England. It's practiced with rather less fanfare and in more limited degrees in a considerable number of other countries, and indeed most of the countries that have very successful and internationally high-ranking systems have some element of this overt competition between institutions. So in England, it was a clear choice of a policy because it was seen as better and more effective and in a way offering higher quality for less cost and less wasteful regulation than the alternatives. And the introduction of student fees as the main conduit for teaching funding via income paid up front by the state via income contingent loans was seen as a major boost to use of market forces. And the general argument has been bought into by the either most or a very large proportion of politicians on all sides of the House. And as I said, this is not just an English thing. And everybody expected price competition and innovation. Well, we have had a certain amount of competition. We have a large amount of competition in research funding, as we've seen, but we have had, since then, intense competition to enroll students, especially since number controls were lifted. And one of the most obvious results has been a huge increase in the number of unconditional offers made to 18-year-olds to try and get them to come to your institution. And conditional unconditional offer is an unconditional offer which only stands if you choose us. So if you will choose me as one of your two choices on UCAS, you can then have an unconditional offer. And over a third of 18-year-olds got one last year. So on the one hand, there's competition, yet everyone is doing 3-year degrees and everyone is charging the same. So it's not a very effective model. And basically, that's a result of the funding rules. But maybe you might say it's just we're not doing it enough. So what I thought I would tell you about a little bit is the American for-profit story. Because in America, the for-profits were given, well, this was taken much further. The federal government gives a large amount of student aid. It doesn't regulate fees. And higher education fees have been rising very rapidly, far faster than inflation. And there's a general view that, shared by a lot of people, that universities are monopolies, they're non-innovative, they're basically there to protect the interests of their staff, they're basically gouging the student and gouging the taxpayer, and therefore, the argument went, at which point quite a lot of people stopped buying in, but this was the argument. If you have far clearer, if you make it much easier for new providers to come in, if you make it much easier for new institutions to start up, you'll finally bring down prices and you'll finally get people who really use new technology, revolutionize teaching, and actually break the system open. And you don't need to have an army of several million inspectors. You don't need to have the rules. You don't need to have the regulations. You control the higher education sector and you drive up quality through competition and price. And for a while it seemed to work. The University of Phoenix was the largest university in the United States. It was largely online. It had nearly 500,000 students. And there were other large and profitable providers, including Corinthian, which at its peak enrolled more than 110,000 students. But remarkably fast came the bust. The numbers collapsed. Half the campuses of Phoenix are closed. Corinthian declared bankruptcy. And 98% of the failing programs identified by the US Department of Education are at profit institutions. Now, why is the theory wrong? Because what it tells you is that governments can do very, very bad policies. Because these are not painless failures. These are students who are left with debts. These are students who spent years of their life at institutions whose name then vanishes and who are left with nothing. Well, there are some very good reasons why it failed, and they're not just to do with inadequate regulation. They're to do with the fact that students cannot judge the quality of a program. And this goes back to the fact that the state has to be involved in creating institutions. Because if you cannot tell the quality of a program, and especially if you are not from a highly advantaged family, then if you also have a market which has relatively low barriers to entry, if you're encouraging new people, what you get is entry by people who are, at their worst, fraudulent, and quite often inexperienced, greedy, and wildly over-optimistic about the prospects for expansion. And the US experience has been echoed elsewhere, including, for example, Poland and Australia. Now, the problem is, what next? The state can't pull out of higher education. Markets cannot deliver on their own. The boom and bust that we've seen in in the United States, though also interestingly, another place where you've seen a bit of it is the east coast of China, just shows again and again, you cannot just leave it to that. So you can't say, my policy is to just hold the ring. But we've also seen that the state can't micromanage. When it tries to micromanage, you get modernizing medical degrees, you get the QAA, you get, or else you just stifle the ability of any institution to do anything innovative. Detailed regulation is hugely costly, and we know that the best systems are those where institutions have autonomy. But a situation in which you give large sums of money to institutions with very little interference, so this is basically state money, is, I have to say, also one in which you create for those institutions the power to extract rent. And the concern that underlay this disastrous history of American for-profit encouragement, the basis of that was this growing concern at the levels of debt and the apparently remorseless rise in the cost of higher education. So you have states which, for a while, created very good higher education policy. It was small scale, it was personal, it was value-based, it was also based on competition and on a desire to be top. We now have mass higher education for all the reasons that I discussed last week, and we have states that are grappling rather hopelessly with how on earth to manage this. Regulation doesn't seem to be the answer. Autonomy creates its own problems. We're seeing a backlash in the media response to universities at the moment. There's no question that looking at it from an economist's point of view, this is a situation in which you extract rent. So where next? I don't have the answer. There are a limited number of tools that you can have as a government. You run things directly, or you leave it to the market, or you hand over the money and let people spend it. None of this seems to work very well for higher education. We know that institutions matter. We know that financial incentives work. If you say to people, come on in everybody, everybody comes in. We know that governance matters, and we know that information matters, but also that information problems in higher education are really hard to tackle. How do you let students know whether an institution is any good? How do you have any control over science funding other than by leaving it to the scientists? So I have a considerable amount of sympathy for governments, even though I think at the moment they're making a pretty fair hash of higher education policy. I don't know how one will do it much better at this scale. The one thing I would say is that if you look at history, major change comes from new institutions. It comes from new institutions, and it comes from new countries, and indeed sometimes from revolutions. It doesn't come normally from gradual evolution. So I think that probably what we're in for is a more or less dispiriting cycle of regulation, vast amounts of information which nobody can digest, dissatisfaction with universities, experimentation yet again with wholesale throw open the doors or wholesale central planning, and somewhere there's a germ of something which is going to be the successor to the research university. But honestly, I haven't a clue what it is. Thank you.